In a world ruled by power, money, and ruthless corporations, a 16-year-old girl walks into a boardroom filled with men who built an empire on lies. What they don't know is that she came prepared to burn their kingdom to the ground. This is the story of Alexis Williams, the girl who turned a billion-dollar company upside down. Alexis Williams stood in the marble-floored boardroom, a place so polished and cold it looked like it had never welcomed someone like her before. 16, sharp-eyed, and carrying a quiet strength that unsettled everyone present. She walked in with the posture of someone who didn't come to ask for permission. The executives of Peterson Holdings stared at her as if she had wandered into the wrong universe. Their tailored suits, silver watches, and rigid expressions formed an unspoken wall meant to intimidate. Alexis didn't flinch. Richard Peterson, the CEO, leaned back in his leather chair, smirking with the confidence of a man who believed he knew exactly who mattered in his world. "Miss Williams, is it?" His voice dripped with mock politeness. "This is a restricted meeting. You shouldn't be here." A few executives chuckled quietly, exchanging amused looks. To them, she was nothing but a child, an intruder, and worse. An intruder who didn't fit the image of the Peterson legacy. But Alexis didn't respond to the laughter. She placed her worn backpack on the glossy table, the sound echoing through the room with unexpected authority. Her hands were steady. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said, her voice soft but impossible to ignore. "I'm here as the legal heir of Thomas Peterson." The room froze. For a moment, no one moved. A few confused murmurs filled the space, executives whispering to each other, their faces shifting from amusement to annoyance. Richard straightened, his smirk tightening. "Thomas Peterson had no daughter," he said flatly. "I think you're confused." Alexis reached into her backpack and took out a simple folder. Not a sleek case like theirs, just a faded, carefully protected document holder. When she slid it across the table, the executives hesitated before leaning forward. Inside were 3 items: a DNA report, a birth certificate, and the original copy of Thomas Peterson's will. Their reactions shifted instantly. The chuckles died. A few eyes widened. One executive drew in a slow breath, reading the documents twice, as if the words might change the second time. The DNA report was legitimate. The birth certificate bore Thomas's name, and the will, dated 16 years ago, stated that upon her 16th birthday, Alexis Williams was to inherit Thomas Peterson's personal share in the corporation. Richard's jaw tightened. "This doesn't prove anything," he snapped. But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "It proves everything you've tried to bury," Alexis replied. Meeting his stare without hesitation, images from her past flickered through her. Memories she hadn't expected to matter until now. Growing up in a quiet suburban neighborhood with her grandmother, she had always sensed a missing piece in her life. Her grandmother never spoke ill of her father. She simply spoke carefully. Alexis remembered the hushed conversations, the way her grandmother's eyes softened whenever she mentioned Thomas. She remembered the box hidden in the attic, the one she found by accident photos, of a tall man with the same eyes she saw in the mirror. But the truth didn't fully surface until her grandmother passed away and left her a letter. Along with the documents she now placed before the board, the letter revealed everything. Thomas's secret visits, his promises, his fear of the corporate world that had trapped him, and the will he signed to ensure his daughter would one day claim her rightful place. He had wanted to protect her from the greed that surrounded him. Alexis lifted her chin, grounding herself in his memory. She had not come here seeking charity. She had come because Thomas believed she could stand here, because he trusted her with something the company refused to acknowledge. The executives whispered nervously, realizing the danger this revelation posed. The conversation shifted from amusement to strategy, from dismissal to panic. The room carried an undercurrent of tension, racial judgment, fear of scandal, questions of legitimacy, the dread of losing control. Richard's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "Even if any of this is real," he said, struggling to maintain composure, "you don't understand what you're getting into. This company isn't for someone like me." Alexis cut in gently, her gaze unwavering. Silence returned, heavier this time. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every word she spoke carried the weight of truth and a calm confidence none of them expected. My father intended for me to be here today, and I know more about what happened to him and about this company than any of you think. A ripple of unease ran through the boardroom. Executives shifted in their seats. Richard's eyes narrowed. There was something in her tone, something that suggested she carried more than just documents. She carried secrets, knowledge, leverage, the kind of leverage only someone who had been quietly watching could possess. Alexis closed the folder and stood a little taller. You can deny me. You can challenge me, but you cannot erase me. Her presence no longer felt like a mistake. It felt like a storm for men quiet, focused, and unstoppable. And in that moment, the entire boardroom realized something chilling. The girl who shouldn't have been there was exactly the person they should have feared. The tension in the boardroom thickened as Alexis remained in the center of the grand table, her calm gaze sweeping across the executives who were slowly beginning to understand that this was no ordinary teenager. She opened her bag again, this time pulling out a second folder, thicker, heavier, and filled with papers no outsider should ever possess. When she placed it on the table, the executives leaned back as if the folder itself was dangerous. Alexis spoke quietly, her voice steady in a way that made everyone listen. She began outlining confidential company failures. The board had desperately tried to hide racial discrimination lawsuits they had buried under settlements, major clients who had pulled out after internal scandals, and board members who had threatened to expose Richard's behavior before mysteriously resigning. With each revelation, faces around the table shifted from irritation to horror. One executive finally blurted out what they all were thinking. How do you know any of this? Alexis didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let the silence settle, forcing them to confront their own fear. Then she calmly said she had been studying the company for months, its patterns, its inconsistencies, its secrets. She told them she had read old annual reports, leaked memos, abandoned audit drafts, a conned, and every public document that hinted at something wrong beneath the surface. She had followed the trails the company assumed no one cared to look at. And piece by piece, she had assembled the truth they worked so hard to bury before anyone could respond. The boardroom doors swung open with a forceful echo. Margaret Collins entered, a name that once carried weight in Peterson Holdings. Former vice president, known for integrity. Forced out abruptly by Richard under suspicious circumstances, the executives stiffened at the sight of her as if seeing a ghost. But Margaret was not here as a disgraced ex-executive. She was here as Alexa's legal guardian and the woman Thomas had trusted to protect his daughter if anything ever happened to him. She walked to Alexa's side without hesitation, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. A gesture that made Richard's composure crack. Margaret carried a small digital recorder in her hand, one that looked old enough to belong to a previous decade. She set it on the table, its metallic click sounding louder than it should have. She explained that it contained an audio recording Thomas made on the final night of his life hours before the accident. The company insisted was purely unfortunate. Instantly, panic flickered across Richard's eyes. Margaret didn't play the recording yet. She simply reminded the room that Thomas's death was ruled sudden, but not everyone had believed it. Least of all Thomas himself, who had become increasingly paranoid that someone within the company wanted him silenced. Alexis took over again, detailing how she had begun digging through her father's past the moment she learned who he really was. She described finding gaps in company archives, documents missing from financial reports, emails erased from servers, and internal memos that should have existed but were nowhere to be found. She spoke of database logs she obtained showing records deleted by accounts linked directly to Richard Peterson. Her voice never wavered, even as the executives shifted uncomfortably, realizing the depth of her access. She wasn't guessing, she had proof. Then Alexis delivered the part none of them expected. She revealed that she had tracked down Robert Davidson, a former company accountant who had vanished from the corporate world years ago. They remembered Davidson. He was the man who once questioned irregularities in company funds before suddenly leaving for personal reasons. But Alexis had found him living quietly under a different city. Still haunted by what he had witnessed, Davidson had kept everything: hidden ledgers, duplicate accounting backups, Printouts of transfers routed through non-existent suppliers and shell companies that led back to Richard. Money laundering, fraud, embezzlement, crimes buried under the company's polished exterior. When Alexis mentioned Davidson's name, several board members flinched. Some exchanged terrified glances, silently calculating what implicating Richard might mean for them. Their denial cracked. Their confidence evaporated. The empire Richard built on intimidation and manipulation was now trembling. Richard tried to recover his authority, slamming his palm on the table as he insisted this was all a fabrication. But his voice lacked conviction. He was drowning in evidence, surrounded by people who had been quietly resenting his leadership for years. Margaret looked him in the eye, calm and composed. As she reminded him that Thomas had warned her something like this might happen, warned her that if anything ever happened to him, the truth would be buried unless someone brave enough dug it up. The room filled with uneasy murmurs. Executives whispering among themselves, trying to distance their names from Richard's actions. Some looked guilty. Others looked afraid. But all of them understood one thing clearly. This was no longer about a teenage girl claiming her inheritance. This was about the entire foundation of Peterson Holdings cracking open. Alexis watched them with quiet determination. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She simply presented truth after truth. Knowing each revelation tightened the noose around the lies that had ruled this company for far too long. And as the executives realized they were cornered, a silent fear settled over the room because this was only the beginning. The boardroom felt as if it were holding its breath. A fragile bubble of tension ready to burst. The executives were still reeling from the evidence Alexis and Margaret had placed before them when Alexis slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. The gesture seemed harmless at first, barely noticeably, till she turned the screen toward them. The bright, glowing words made several executives lurch to their feet in shock. A live broadcast timer. Comments scrolling at lightning speed. A viewer count climbing past 40,000. Alexis had been streaming the entire confrontation from the moment she walked into the building. Every word, every frightened whisper, every attempt to dismiss her captured and witnessed by tens of thousands of people across the country. For a heartbeat, the room went silent. Then outrage erupted. You're live streaming this? An executive gasped, his voice trembling as he pointed at the phone like it was a weapon. Alexis nodded calmly. She explained that she didn't trust Peterson Holdings to let her walk out of this room alive with the truth. Too many things about her father's death were suspicious. Too many people around the company had vanished or been silenced after questioning Richard. She had learned the hard way that secrets only stay buried if they remain in the dark. So she brought the truth into the light where no one could hide it again. The comments exploded people, demanding justice. Tagging reporters, calling out the executives by name as Alexis revealed the documents, the audio recording and the financial evidence. The board members realized, with growing horror, that they weren't facing a scared teenager. They were facing the court of public opinion, live and unfiltered. But panic wasn't the strongest reaction in the room. Richard snapped, his carefully crafted mask of dignity and control shattered in an instant. He pointed at Alexis with a shaking hand, his face twisting with rage, spitting out insults that carried years of prejudice he had always hidden behind polished smiles. It wasn't just anger, it was hatred, raw and unrestrained, spilling out in front of 40,000 viewers. The racist slurs echoed through the boardroom, ugly and unmistakable. Executives recoiled as if the words were physical blows. Even those who had supported Richard felt nauseated watching his downfall unravel in real time. Alexis didn't respond. She didn't need to. The live stream captured everything. The world would judge him far more harshly than she ever could. Richard lunged toward her. But before he could take 2 steps, the boardroom doors swung open again, this time with the heavy authority of law enforcement. Federal agents filed in, badges raised, their presence cold and unmistakable. One stepped forward and addressed Alexis respectfully, confirming her identity. Another agent turned to the room and announced arrest warrants for Richard Peterson, James Crawford, and Michael Torres. The names echoed across the livestream chat like shockwaves. Richard backed away instinctively. You can't do this." "I built this company, you built a criminal enterprise," an agent replied bluntly. The room descended into chaos. James Crawford tried to run, making it barely 3 steps before 2 agents pinned him against the table. Michael Torres fell to his knees, pleading that he only followed orders. Richard, trembling and red-faced, shouted for lawyers, threatened everyone in the room, and finally tried to blame Alexis for everything only to be handcuffed. Mid-sentence, agents then placed a tablet on the table and began playing the video Robert Davidson had submitted. It showed financial spreadsheets, signed orders, hidden accounts, and audio where Richard openly instructed Davidson to falsify numbers and move funds through shell accounts. The recording became the final nail-clear. Undeniable evidence. Executives who had once boasted about their power were now begging for leniency, insisting they never knew what Richard was doing. Some cried. Others tried to walk out quietly as if they could pretend none of this involved them. But agents were stationed at every exit. No one was going anywhere. Through all of this, Alexis stood still, composed, watching the corruption she had exposed crumble piece by piece. Once the final arrested executive was escorted away, a strange hush settled over the room. Margaret stepped forward, carrying Thomas's final envelope, the one she had kept hidden for 16 years. She opened it slowly, the paper worn and yellowed but still bearing Thomas's unmistakable signature. Inside was the truth that would change everything. Thomas had left Alexis 51% of his controlling shares. Not symbolic, not partial, a majority stake. Enough to control the company outright. Alexis took the document in her hands. Reading her father's handwriting, feeling the weight of everything he had hoped she would become. Margaret's voice softened as she explained that Thomas had suspected the board would fight his heir, so he left a safeguard. Alexis wasn't just entitled to a seat at the table. She owned the table. She took a deep breath, stepped to the head of the boardroom, and addressed the remaining executives. Her voice was steady, carrying the kind of authority no one could question now. She told them that, effective immediately, every corrupt board member involved in covering up crimes, manipulating finances, or enabling Richard's behavior was terminated. The decision was final. No negotiations. No appeals. The executives stared at her, stunned into silence, and Alexis, at 16 years old, claimed the company her father left behind, not as a frightened orphan, but as the rightful leader who had brought justice into a room that had never expected her to survive it. 6 months later, the building that once felt like a fortress designed to keep her out now stood transformed under her name. The marble floors no longer echoed with intimidation, but with possibility. The Peterson Holdings sign had been removed, quietly one dawn morning, and replaced with a new emblem, Williams Peterson Corporation. The merging of names was intentional. Alexis, honoring the father she barely knew while reclaiming the legacy that had been stolen from both of them. Under her leadership, the company had undergone a metamorphosis so profound that even long-time employees struggled to recognize what it once had been. The first change came from the people she chose. Instead of recycling the same power-hungry executives who once thrived under silence, Alexis built a new leadership team from talent overlooked for years. People of color, women, young innovators, first-generation graduates, and individuals who had never been given a chance in the corporate world. She sought them out, interviewed them personally, and selected them for their integrity, vision, and grit. The boardroom that had once been a closed circle of privilege now reflected the world outside its windows. Ideas flowed freely. Decisions were made ethically. The company, for the first time in its history, felt alive. The transformation rippled outward. Profits didn't just rise, they tripled. Investors who had abandoned Peterson Holdings returned, impressed by transparency and accountability. Clients who once threatened to sever ties now praised the company's rebirth. But the financial success mattered far less to Alexis than what those profits allowed her to fix. With meticulous record tracking, her team recovered millions of dollars that had been stolen through shell companies and fraudulent accounts. Instead of pocketing the reclaimed funds or using them to inflate corporate vanity projects, she redirected them into the people who had been harmed by the company's past. A scholarship fund in her grandmother's name helped hundreds of young students. The pursue educations they once believed were out of reach. A community program restored housing and provided legal aid for families affected by predatory contracts the old board had approved. She created paid internships for underprivileged youth, opening doors that had once been locked to her. Former employees who had been fired for refusing to participate in corruption received compensation, apologies, and if they wished, their jobs back. Every decision Alexis made felt like stitching together wounds the company had inflicted long before she arrived. People began calling her a prodigy, a revolutionary, a symbol of ethical leadership. But Alexis never allowed the praise to consume her. She knew rebuilding wasn't about ego, it was about responsibility. And she carried that responsibility with the quiet strength. She had learned from the two people who shaped her the most, her grandmother's unwavering resilience and her father's unseen love. Meanwhile, the men who once dominated the company's hierarchy faced the consequences they had always believed they were untouchable enough to avoid. Richard Peterson was serving his sentence in a federal penitentiary, stripped of his influence, his reputation in ruins. His name became synonymous with corporate fraud and the arrogance of men who believed their power would protect them forever. James Crawford and Michael Torres faded into public disgrace. Their careers dissolved, their names whispered only with cautionary disgust. None of them had recovered, not from the truth, not from their downfall, and certainly not from being outplayed by the 16-year-old girl they underestimated, Robert Davidson. The accountant, who had carried guilt for years, found his life healed in ways he never expected. Alexis created a foundation in his Neiman organization, dedicated to protecting whistleblowers and supporting employees who faced retaliation for speaking out. For the first time since he fled the company, Davidson stood tall, his voice no longer shaking, his conscience finally at peace. Alexis didn't just save him, she restored him. But the greatest changes happened quietly within Alexis herself. She often walked the halls of the corporation late in the evening, absorbing the transformation around her. The boardroom, once the stage of her greatest confrontation, now felt like an extension of her strength. She stood at the head of the table where Richard had once tried to destroy her, and looked at the city skyline through the glass walls. That view, once overwhelming, now reflected her triumph. She thought about revenge sometimes, not the vengeful fire that consumed people, but the kind that rebuilt worlds. She had discovered that true revenge wasn't about crushing enemies or sinking to their level. It wasn't about retaliation or hatred or proving she was stronger. It was about building something better than they ever could, something they never had the courage or the heart to imagine. It was about rising so high that their attempts to destroy her became meaningless shadows beneath her feet as she traced her fingers across the polished table. She felt her father's presence like a steady heartbeat. Thomas Peterson had not lived long enough to see the empire he once feared become something beautiful in his daughter's hands. But Alexis felt him in every victory, every rebuilt life, every restored injustice. She carried his memory not as a burden, but as a guiding light. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the quiet power of the room. The girl who had walked in carrying a worn backpack and a truth no one wanted to hear was gone. In her place stood a leader in yielding, compassionate, unbreakable. Alexis opened her eyes, standing tall as the city lights shimmered behind her, and whispered the words that had guided her through every battle, every revelation. Every impossible moment, her father didn't leave her legacy to protect. He left her one to complete, and she had done exactly that.